Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to this video series on the Comptia Security Plus course, moving and copying folders and files. This subject and the previous one are actually more advanced Microsoft concepts. The type you will be asked on a Microsoft exam and less likely to be asked on a Comptia exam. So we'll try to keep this simple. Moving and copying folders have different results when it comes to permissions. Basically, it breaks down like this. If you copy a folder or file on the same volume or to a different volume, the folder inherits the permissions of the parent folder it was copied to target directory. If you move a folder or file to a different location on the same volume, the folder retains its original permissions. You cannot move a folder to a separate volume. If you attempt to do so, it'll automatically be copied to the other volume. Usernames and passwords. The most common type of authentication is the username password combination. Usernames are usually based on a person's real name. Large organizations often use first name dot last name as a standard naming convention. For example, David Ryan at company.com, or the first initial and the last name dryan at company.com. Smaller organizations might use the first name and last initial. The naming convention decided upon should be easy for you to implement without name confusion, and it should have the capability to be utilized for all systems on the network, including login, email, database, file access, and so on. The password is either set by the user or created automatically for the user by an administrator or system. Figure 11.8 shows an example of a password created by an administrator. However, in this case, the user is not blocked from changing the password unless a policy was created for that purpose. Note that the second checkbox, user cannot change password, is not selected. As an administrator, you also have the option to select user must change password at next logon. A user would have to pick a password when he first logs onto the domain, one that meets whatever complexity requirements your network calls for. This is with the self-service password resetting. When users reset their own passwords at regular intervals, it is necessary in larger networks to ease administration and increase security. The only caveat to this is account lockouts. Unlocking accounts that were locked out by the system should be done only by an administrator or system operator. At this point, it is common knowledge that a strong password is important for protecting a user account. Nowadays, many user accounts are compromised because of laziness. Laziness on the part of the user for not configuring a strong password, or lethargic complacency on the part of the administrator for not enforcing the use of strong passwords. But what is a strong password? That depends on the organization you deal with, but generally it is broken down into a few easy to remember points. Passwords should comply with the following: contain uppercase letters, contain lowercase letters, contain numbers, contain special characters, symbols, should be between 8 to 10 characters or more. Some organizations that have extremely sensitive data will require 15 characters at a minimum. The weak password and vendor set default password can lead to data breaches. Attackers use weak or known passwords to access accounts and then perform unauthorized copying, transfer, and retrieval from data from servers, collectively known as data exfiltration. Data exfiltration is also known as data extrusion, data exportation, or simply stated data theft. Whatever you call it, the complex password and properly configured password policies can help to prevent it. Changing your password at regular intervals is important as well. The general rule of thumb is to change your password as often as you change your toothbrush. However, because this is a subjective concept, to put it nicely, many organizations have policies configuring your password that we discuss in the next section. It might need to meet certain requirements or be changed at regular intervals and so forth. Here are a few tips when it comes to user accounts, passwords and logins. Rename and password protect the administrator account. It is nice that Windows has incorporated a separate administrator account. The problem is that by default the account has no password. To configure this account, navigate to computer management system tools, local users and groups, users, and locate the administrator account on a Windows server acting as a domain controller. This will be in the ADUC domain name users. By right clicking the account, you can see a drop down menu in which you can rename it and or give it a password. Now it's great to have this additional administrator account on the shelf just in case the primary account fails. However, your organization's policy might call for disabling, which can be done by right clicking the account and selecting disable account. In older Windows systems, you would access the general tab of the account and select the account is disabled checkbox. Then you would use that separate account previously created with administrative rights as your main administrative account. If you need access to the actual administrator account, it can be re-enabled using the methods previously described. Alternatively, open the command line and type the following: net user administrator / active yes. The way that the administrator account behaves by default depends on the version of Windows. The Linux/Unix counterpart is the root account. The same types of measures should be employed when dealing with this account. Verifying that the guest account or other necessary accounts is disabled. This can be done by right clicking the account in question, selecting properties and then selecting the checkbox named account is disabled. It is also possible to delete accounts aside from built-in accounts such as the guest account. However, companies usually opt to have them disabled instead so the company can retain information linking to the account. So if an employee is terminated, the system administrator should generally implement a policy of account disablement. By disabling the account, the employee in question can no longer log into the network, but the administrator still has access to the history of that account. Use Control-Alt-Delete. Pressing Control-Alt-Delete before login adds a layer of security to the login process by ensuring that users are communicating by means of a trusted path when entering passwords. This can be added in Windows 10 by going to Run, typing netplwiz, which opens the user account dialog box. Then going to the Advanced tab and selecting the checkbox require users to press Control-Alt-Delete, or can be added as a policy on individual Windows computers within local group policy editor. It is implemented by default for computers that are members of a domain. Use policies governing user accounts, passwords and so on can help you to enforce your rules as discussed in the next section. Large organizations with a lot of users usually implement a self-service password management system. This means that users reset their own passwords after a given amount of time set in group policy. The administrator does not create passwords for users. Policies are rules or guidelines used to guide decisions and achieve outcomes. They can be written and configured on a computer. The former, the more difficult to enforce, whereas the latter would have been hacked to be bypassed. Local computer policies and network policies are what really make an access control model effective. Password policies can be implemented to enforce the usage of complex passwords and regulate how long passwords last. They can be configured on local computers such as Windows operating systems by navigating to Administrative Tools, Local Security Policy. When in the Local Policy Settings window, continue to Security Settings, Account Policy, Password Policy. More important policies can be configured for an entire network. For example, on a Microsoft domain, This would be known as a group policy, and there can be more than one. A group policy can affect the entire domain or an individual organizational unit. The main group policy is known as the default domain policy. Figure 11.9 shows an example of the default domain policy added to an MMC. To access the password policy section, you would navigate to Computer Configuration Policy, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Account Settings, Password Policy. Figure 11.9, password policy on a Windows Server domain controller. When password policy is selected, you see the following policies. Enforce password policy. When this is defined, users cannot use any of the passwords remembered in the history. If you set the history to 3, the last 3 passwords cannot be reused when it is time to change the password. Maximum and minimum password age. This defines exactly how long a password can be used. The maximum is initially set to 42 days, but does not affect the default administrator account. To enforce effective password policy, the minimum must be higher than 0. This is part of a category known as password expiration. Minimum password length. This requires that the password must be at least the specified number of characters. For a strong password policy, set this to 8 or more, as long as other complex requirements are also set. If not, the password should be longer. Password must meet complexity requirements. This means that passwords must meet 3 of these 4 criteria: uppercase characters, lowercase characters, digits between 0 and 9, and non-alphabetic characters, special characters. To effectively stop users from using the same password, a security administrator should combine the enforce password history policy with the minimum password age policy. The minimum password age policy must be less than the maximum password age setting and must be more than 0 to enforce a password history policy. In addition, the security administrator might need to create a policy that states that passwords cannot be changed more than once a day. This would prevent users from changing their passwords X number of times in an attempt to bypass that password history policy. Remember that all these policies, when enabled, affect all users to which the policy applies. If it is the default domain policy, usually not recommended for configuration, it affects all users. If it is an OU policy, it affects all users in the OU, which is organizational unit. There are plenty of other policies that you can configure. You can pretty much configure any policy on a domain. You can't configure how a person should shave in the morning, but anything computer related can be modified and policed. One example is how many attempts a person is allowed when typing in a password. This is known as the account lockout threshold, as shown in figure 11.10. Many companies adjust this to 3. This is known as the 3 strikes and you're out rule. Another great tool is the previous logon notification. This can be configured in a policy and shows the user the last time the account logged in successfully, generally during a logon process. If a user suspects that their account was compromised, they could check the previous logon notification and compare that with when they remembered logging in. It is important to note that when logging in onto a Microsoft network, the login process is secured by the Kerberos protocol, which is run by the domain controller. This adds a layer of protection for the username and password as they are authenticated across the network. When a user takes a break or go to lunch, they should lock the computer. This can be done by pressing Windows L. When doing so, the operating system goes into a lock state, and the only way to unlock the computer is to enter the username and password of the person who locked the computer. The difference between this and logging out is that a locked computer keeps all the session applications and files open, whereas logging out closes all applications and open files. A policy can be configured to force locking after a certain amount of time has elapsed. Literally hundreds of policies are configurable. You could spend weeks doing it. Microsoft understands this and offers various levels of security templates that can be imported into your OU policy, making your job as an administrator a bit easy. A particular template might be just what you're looking for, or it might need a bit of tweaking, but in most cases it beats starting from scratch. Policies can be developed on all kinds of software and systems, not just operating systems. For example, many organizations have websites, and a good portion of those organizations now set up bulletin board systems where authorized users can post messages. Bulletin boards are also known as forums or portals. Bulletin boards are often the playground for malicious activity. For example, users or bots posting spam messages. Various policies can be implemented on an interactive bulletin board system to prevent these types of problems. For example, when people first register, they would need to answer a question that requires something they know, such as 2 + 4 = blank. The user would enter the answer 6 and continue on their merry way. Another viable option is to use Comptia, completely automated public testing, to tell computers and humans apart, which can display an image that has letters and numbers in it. The user must type the letters and numbers that they see before they can register, or perhaps to post any messages at all. This is a good deterrent for bots. User account control, UAC. User account control is a security component of Windows that keeps every user besides the actual administrator account in standard user mode, instead of as an administrator with full administrative rights. Even if the person is a member of the administrators group, it is meant to prevent unauthorized access as well as avoid use error in the form of accidental changes. With UAC enabled, users perform common tasks as non-administrators, and when necessary as administrators, without having to switch users off, log off and run as. Basically, UAC was created with two goals in mind: to eliminate unnecessary requests for excessive administrator level access to Windows resources, to reduce the risk of malicious software using the administrator's access control to infect operating system files. When a standard end user requires administrative privilege to perform certain tasks, such as installing an application, a small pop-up UAC window appears notifying the user that an administrator credential is necessary. If the user has administrative rights and clicks continue, the task is carried out, but if the user does not have sufficient rights, the attempt fails. Note that these pop-up UAC windows do not appear if the person is logged in with the actual administrator account. There are other examples of generic account prohibition that work in the same manner as UAC. Third-party tools are available for Windows and Linux. An administrator might find that UAC does not have the configurability they desire. Regardless of the type of account prohibition used, it is important to conduct user access reviews, audit of what users have been able to access over time, and continuously monitor users' actions in this regard. Chapter summary. In order to have an efficient computer network, the security administrator needs to be in control. This is still feasible even in today's complicated computer networks. An admin can choose from several basic access control models: discretionary access control, DAC, mandatory access control, MAC, role-based access control, RBAC, and attribute based access control, ABAC. Probably the most common is DAC. Many Windows controlled and Linux controlled networks utilize this model. Whatever the model, remember that they are based on subjects, users, and objects, data files, and other resources. For access control to work well, it is wise to implement certain concepts such as implicit deny, where all traffic is denied except for what a user specifically needs, least privilege, where a user is only given the permission necessary to perform a task, separation of duties, where more than one person is required to complete a task, and job rotation, where a pool of people can work on the same individual job if necessary. Used together, an access control model can be very effective, and a lot of the concepts in the preceding two paragraphs are intangibles. To secure access to data in the technical sense, permissions and policies are your best friends. Both large and small networks can benefit from the use of permissions and groups of users. Using permissions enables a more secure system. Using groups of users allows you to automate the distribution of permissions to multiple users at once. Permissions are also known as rights, access modes, and depending on the scenario, access control lists, ACLs. The common Windows system uses a set of 6 NTFS permissions, spanning from the ability to read files only all the way to having full control of those files. In Unix, Linux-based systems, 3 types of permissions, read, write, and execute, are assigned to users, groups, and owners by way of 3-digit number and the chmod command. Access control also hinges on authentication, the most common form of which is the username password combination. The importance of complex passwords cannot be stressed enough. An organization will often require 8 to 10 characters minimum, including uppercase letters, numbers, and special characters, and all of this is usually enforced by a computerized policy. Password policies such as password history, maximum password age, minimum password length, and password complexity requirements, if configured properly, can offer your users a decent level of protection. The user accounts themselves can also be secured with the use of user account lockouts, time of day restrictions, and user account control. We mentioned in the beginning of the chapter that you don't want any Tom, Dick, or Harry to gain access to your data. If you don't control access to your data, it is the equivalent of allowing the Three Stooges into your servers. That's funny. You'll be surprised how many companies disregard best practice for access control, but when it comes to this layer of security, a little bit of planning and the modest piece of automated configuration can go a long way. So I'm going to here today for this video. If you like listening, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you.